So, Natalie Evans Harris, thank you so much for speaking to me and through me to this class of students all over the world who are learning about algorithms, AI, and machine learning. And they're doing it from a bunch of different disciplines. Some are interested in math and computer science, some in psychology or current events, lots of different possibilities here. But I think all of us have an interest in the work you're doing, especially around ethics and in this field. But before we get into that, would you just tell us a little bit about your career and kind of the arc of it to this point?
Sure. One, thank you for having me. This is really, I've never done anything like this. This is really interesting. My career has been, I don't know, I feel like I'm on a journey to figure out how to solve the world with data, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have a bachelor's degree in sociology and a bachelor's degree in computer science. And then I have a master's degree in public administration. All of that to say that I've always been extremely interested in the intersection of tech and society. I like to say that even though I can code, I'm much more interested in seeing innovation be used to solve really hard problems than I am in actually building the solution. And that's just, you learn during your career where you fit. And I learned very early in my career that that was my fit. So I've spent a majority of my career in the federal government leading teams that built interesting data-driven solutions. Started with the National Security Agency and spent most of my career there and across the intelligence community as a project lead, as a information systems security engineer, and then moved up into management where I had the opportunity to establish NSA's first data science immersion program, where we were able to begin to look at skills for data scientists versus just their degrees. So recognizing that a strong data scientist doesn't necessarily just have to have a computer science degree, but also should have some type of contextual social science degree or an analytics degree, and can also be teachers in any form of backgrounds can make for really interesting data scientists. So I did that for about 10 years, about 15 years before I moved over to take a fellowship. I wanted to do a little bit more with my sociology degree. And so I went and did a fellowship with Brookings. And with that fellowship, I had the opportunity to work on Capitol Hill as a tech fellow and support Senator Cory Booker's office in understanding the tech implications of many of their policies. So in particular, I got to work on CISPA, the Information Security Privacy Act. That was hot at that time, and then also was their lead fellow for the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. So using my governmental background to support some of their efforts on that committee. And then I met DJ Patil and Megan Smith while I worked on the Hill, and they both worked under the Obama administration. Megan Smith was the first female chief technology officer for the United States, and DJ Patil was the very first chief data scientist for the United States. And when I met them, we had a great connection. We talked, and I really wanted to support government in their use of data. So one of the things I learned once I took this fellowship was that strong government practices were not consistent across the federal government. And I really wanted to begin to tackle how we use data to solve really hard problems while still protecting people's privacy and making sure that we were doing more good than harm. And that's become my path for probably the last 5 years. Under the Obama administration, I established a federal data science community of practice called the Data Cabinet. And then when my time ended there, I worked to establish a community of practice of data practitioners interested in establishing some transparent principles for responsible use of data. And they're still live and active now under Data for Democracy. And also I founded a company called Bright Hive, which is really focused on how do we enable social sector organizations to be able to link and share data in a responsible manner and with the right governance in place that allows for drawing insights in a equitable and responsible manner. And then I'm also doing fellowships and all those things. But if you think about my career trajectory, it's always been around this place of how do we use data to solve really hard problems? And now that we're doing that, how do we do it in a way that still protects people?
So I guess technically you're working in a private company of your own right now, but really it's still focused on, as you say, the same themes of data privacy, protecting consumers, protecting citizens. And I'm kind of wondering whether it's did you ever consider going out and making money with these awesome skills that you have, and big money in terms of big companies?
It's a constant thought, right? It's do you want to go work for the large consultant companies and I could probably make twice as much money as I make now, but that's not my passion. And I think it's really important that you balance the need, like I do all right. So you balance that need to have a livable income with that need to be passionate about what you want to do. So I say often that when I left National Security Agency, they were very good to me, and everything I learned there. But I realized that I wasn't passionate about that mission anymore, and that I was really passionate about helping others understand how to responsibly use data. And so that's why I left. And that's why I now do the things I do now. And so while you definitely want to do things that can help you pay for a roof over your head and food in your stomach and whatever your lifestyle is, you also want to make sure that you're doing things you're passionate about, because you have to get up and do it every day. For me, I'm living and breathing this stuff, as my husband will tell you. And so if I don't enjoy it, what are we doing this for, right? And for me.
How is it different to work in government or in your own small, company with a social mission, as opposed to working in a big corporation of any type on data projects?
So there's good and bad with both, right? And not to knock working for the private sector, because when I worked at NSA, everybody that worked under me, not everybody, but a good number of people that worked under me worked for large consulting and large companies. So there's value in both. It really is a personal decision. For me, the motivation and the intentions of working in government and working for public benefit corporations, which is what Bright Hive is really centered around that impact. So you get to that point where you have to make that decision. Do I do this for the money, or do I do this for the impact? And there's always going to be that conflict and that tension between the two, of going after something for the big dollars or not going after something because it doesn't make you enough money. And you just have to know internally what's important to you. I'm very impact driven. I always have been. That's how I ended up in government. So I'm always more focused on what are the things that can drive impact, but also I can still survive by doing it. It's an internal decision.
Were you aware of that focus when you were going through school and just learning to code and learning about algorithms and
it's interesting.
Studying all this?
I did know that the change I wanted to see in the world was a change with the government. I grew up in Bronx, New York, and I saw how challenging it was for people around me to be able to get access to social services, and how difficult government often made it. So I knew that I wanted to help make that easier, and I knew technology and data was a way to do that. I learned that I learned that through my college experience, that, okay, technology and data is the way to do this. I think it wasn't until I started working with Bright Hive and standing up this public benefit company and working in this private sector, and we're going through our first seed round, that I really, really started to figure out that core difference and what that means and what that looks like. So I made the decision to leave the government because I also recognized that in order for government to be successful, there was some capacity building that needed to happen on the private sector side and in the nonprofit side and in these other parts of the ecosystem. So I wanted to work on those sides as well, and learn and do that. And so that's one of the reasons why we chose to go this route with the public benefit corporation versus doing a nonprofit or staying in government and doing the work from the inside. So I will say that I didn't know how different it was going to be until I had to do it. And now that I've done it, I've learned so much about, we can't if we're going to hire people, we have to think about how much money we have in the long run and how they're going to get their benefits. And we really have to make those bottom line decisions. For instance, our decision to go public benefit was because when we started our round, there's a really conscious decision in a board that holds you accountable for your revenue and profits. But if you're a public benefit corporation, you're allowed to put impact above, potential high dollar opportunities. You're allowed to do that, and it protects your CEO in making those decisions. So it's interesting taking some of the things from my impact-driven world and building a company in the private sector with that experience. I recommend everybody do all the things.
Very interesting. Thank you. So you focused a lot on ethical use of data and guidelines for that. And you mentioned your background in growing up in the Bronx. Did you see either there or perhaps later at a different point in your career gross overreaches or lapses in ethics that really led you to this? Was there a sort of a moment where this came into focus, or was it more of a gradual thing?
I would love to be able to say that I knew I was going to be a data scientist from high school or from the moment I was born, but that just wasn't the case. I fell into this world. So I knew going into college that I wanted to work with government at this innovation section of how do we improve government's ability to support people, the people who are most vulnerable and need the government's help the most. And so I knew that going into college. And then I needed a job on campus, and I got it with the IT department because they paid the best. And I was laying cables and doing IT help desk work. And then it really wasn't, and then I found that I enjoyed it. I enjoyed coding and I enjoyed doing this work. And that led me to National Security Agency, where they recruited me to do the work, to do this type of work there. I joined NSA 3 months before September 11th. And that was my first exposure to the importance of access to data and understanding the power of data. So that was my first exposure, was seeing through what happened with September 11th, how the information was there but not available, and how people being able to work together really impacted our ability to proactively prevent something like that. And so that's where I got my kind of first taste of the importance of data in this technology and innovation space. And growing up and grooming in NSA, you learn, and they teach you as a culture, the importance of protecting data and the importance of being responsible with that data and being a good steward. It really wasn't until I left NSA and started working with other government agencies that it became clear that that culture of strong government practices and stewardness wasn't common across the whole government and across other sectors. And it's so important, especially as we begin to use data and the morphing of data and people, individual persons, become so blended together. It's no longer just data and then people. They're really becoming one and the same. So the need to be responsible and thoughtful and intentional about its use is so critical. And so watching things like the breaches that have happened over the years and things that I can't talk about here, and seeing some of the lapses that weren't malicious, weren't intentional. It was really just not understanding that we were creating these vulnerabilities and could do better. The goal is not to punish and not to identify opportunities to bang sticks. My goal is to create opportunities for people to understand what they can do to do better. So if we shift gears just a little bit and then think about, I'm wondering what it's like when you're leading teams of people and trying to get them to collaboratively establish ethical guidelines. Yes.
Is that have you tended to have really good, enthusiastic, willing, excellent collaborators, or are some of them harder to bring to the table? Or how does it, can you tell us a story about that kind of work?
So it's really interesting. When I decided to put my energy into forming the community-driven ethical principles group with Data for Democracy, I had a lot of people that were going, great idea. This is so needed. Let's do it. And so I think you learn very quickly the difference between the supporters and the cheerleaders and the people willing to roll up their sleeves and voluntarily help you do this. And I learned this through CPEDS, and I also learned this through establishing the data cabinet when I was still under the Obama administration. Other duties as assigned and voluntary work, you have to learn very quickly who are going to be your go-to people that you can give responsibilities for. And when you're somebody who wants to launch a collaborative and get people working together, it becomes really important that you establish expectations and roles for people. So for instance, when I started building the community of practice for CPEDS, I didn't just go out and say, hey, who wants to work with me? I was very thoughtful in saying, I need people who can lead out on developing these principles in this very specific way. And it's going to take about 4 meetings, about 2 hours of your time each meeting, and this is how I will help you. And you have to frame it in a way where there's something they get on the other side. Incentives are a really important thing when you want people to collaborate together. And that's just not even voluntary. I mean, across the board, incentives and identifying what motivates people becomes a really important part of building collaboratives. So when I was building CPEDS, I identified people who often worked in the space that I needed a strong volunteer to help me lead out on. And then I connected with them and set up a framework so that they could be successful in a way that they were comfortable. And it was interesting, right? So I had four people that worked for me under CPEDS, and they were all group leaders under this large initiative who were responsible for creating a specific set of principles. And they each worked differently in their group. And so I had to get to know them and their styles to make sure that they had what they needed to be successful as volunteers. And it didn't become a burden, but it became something that they enjoyed doing. And I think it was fairly successful. We grew it from nothing to, I think it's over 1,000 people that are in the group now. And there's still leaders and there's people that are launching their own things within the group and are becoming self-starters. So it becomes really important to create the framework. And I think people take that for granted, that when you start a group, you think if you just bring a lot of people together, magic happens. But that's not the case. When you make a decision to start a group, you really make a decision that you're going to create a framework that allows other people to thrive in their own ways towards this common purpose.
That's really interesting. And when you talk about incentives, what could you really offer? You talk about relationship building, and but in terms of incentives for them to spend this time and do this work, a clean conscience, a sense of personal fulfillment, a dozen donuts. What are you offering?
And so you usually want to tie it to their day jobs, right? So for some of the volunteers, I know at least 2 of them, I also help them craft it in a way that it tied to their day job. So this was something that helped them either with their research that they were doing if they were in school and were researchers. One of them worked for a company, and so this was an opportunity to help with their professional development. And it was something that they could add to their resume as helping and growing a community and having a larger impact. So that's what I'm talking about. There was also one person who was really fresh out of school, and this was an opportunity for them to meet and engage with leaders across the industry, because the advisors that supported CPED were all leaders in the space and worked for larger companies and were respected. So this is an opportunity for them to engage with these people and potentially grow into other opportunities. That's how you, it sounds less, it doesn't sound as good as for the good of the people, but I think that's okay, right? Because you're committing your time and you're not getting paid for it. And so you should get something on the other side for it. If not, why are you doing it? I do this because I do this not just because I want to see good things happen, but it also helps me drive toward this vision of the world that I'd like to see and see data being used. And it helps me with building a career that I enjoy.
Very cool. In the news, we hear an awful lot about unethical data practices, I guess we could say. And, lots of big companies gathering information without the understanding or even permission of users, or without their knowledge or real understanding of what's going on. Do you think, is that improving? And do you see, what kind of path can you envision to a more uniform ethical set of practices in these companies?
So this is the world I'm living in right now, right? Is that we've spent a tremendous amount of time over the last few years, me included, getting various sectors to develop principles. Let's just talk about what is the good we want to see in the use of data. So what are these principles? Where we need to go now is, how do we turn these principles into actions? So I was having this conversation with Chris Wiggins, who is the director of data science for New York Times and also a teacher of data ethics for NYU. And just I go to him for knowledge sometimes. And he and I were having this conversation of, how do you turn principles into actions? And we had this two things that really framed out of that conversation that I think helps this. One is, there's this power struggle that is happening right now. And a lot of what ethics means and adopting responsible data practices often means somebody has to give up power. If you own the data, you are motivated to keep owning that data. So efforts like open data initiatives and things that want to increase transparency are antithesis to that power, right? Because I need to own all of the data. And therefore, I have the power because data is a commodity. So when you think about what using data responsibly and ethically looks like, you have to think about, what is that power dynamic that we are looking for? What power are we looking to give individual people? What power are we looking to give policymakers in being able to frame out what right looks like in defining standards and defining rules? And what power do we want organizations to keep as our primary data collectors? And what does it look like for them to be primary data collectors and still do it responsibly and ethically? So there's this power struggle that we have to start acknowledging and working on as we move towards defining these rules and moving from principles to actions. That's one part. The second part we talked about is, what does it mean to move from principles to action? Like, how do we get organizations to really adopt strong data practices? And that's not just private sector, it's government, it's public sector, it's everybody. So how do we move beyond principles to actually seeing these things ingrained in the way that people do business and handle data? And he sent me this article from LexisNexis that talked about the increased granularity of change of behavior and how it starts with principles, because principles are kind of the what I'll call motherhood and apple pie. It's the vision of how you want to see the world, and it's beautiful, and this is how we all should be. But then to really start putting some meat next to that potato, you need to start looking at standards. And so we're seeing that standards work happen now. We're seeing it with things like the T3 Innovation Network, which is bringing together government and private sector and academia to really talk about how do we develop standards that allow for machines to communicate with each other and share data in a consistent fashion, so that things like student records can be shared without having to go get a transcript from here and walk it over there and, do it that way? How do we get it so that companies are actually, and universities are starting to talk to each other? So we're starting to see these standards get developed that's going to increase the ability of machines to talk to each other in a safe and secure manner. So once we get from principles to standards, now we need to start looking at, well, what are the rules to using these standards? That's where I like to sit, because these standards help develop these frameworks for how machines can talk to each other. But then there needs to be rules for how we govern the use of data as it flows through these machines. And that, to me, is where ethics really matter. So it's really hard to develop rules when we don't have strong standards to do it. And once you've developed those rules for how data should be governed and how data should move throughout these systems, now you can start coding. And now you can start building tools that help enforce these rules. Oftentimes, what we're seeing happen instead is we're seeing, oh, there's a problem, let's build a tool. And then one city will build this amazing tool that will help you understand how to report potholes in your city. Or you'll see a city create a data-driven tool that will help. The example I give often is there was a city in Florida, a county in Florida, that created this data-driven tool for automating bail decisions. So how much bail does an individual get based upon the crime? And so they put all this data into the system, and they use that data and AI in order to allow for the system to determine bail. What was happening as a result of that was that the system was basically automating inherent bias that already existed in that criminal justice system. So individuals that were typically African American, that were typically male, were getting higher bail or no bail compared to white and female, who often would get released, so not even held, or get an extremely low bail. So it was inconsistent. And what they found was that it was based upon inherent bias that was already in the system. That's unethical. It wasn't intentionally unethical, but it was unethical. And it was unethical, and it happened because they built a tool before they looked at their rules and before they'd examined their standards. So there's a process that we're ignoring in the use of data-driven solutions that is creating this tension and this situation that we have right now of tools getting developed that actually can't be scalable because we're missing all of these steps in the middle.
And, if I can back up just a little bit, and you talk about, putting principles into action, mm-hmm. I feel as if there might be a lot of actors in this data space in our country and our world today who don't necessarily even subscribe to the principles.
Yeah.
That, it's like, if we can collect the data, we will collect the data, we will keep the data, we will sell the data. I'm not sure they're really interested in ethical principles.
Right. So that gets back to that gets me back to the power struggle, right?
Right.
There's multiple camps sitting in this. There's some camps that believe in open internet. So let it be the wild, wild west, and things will just work out. I consider that to be a very privileged view of the world. And so there are some people that believe we don't need data ethics and we don't need principles. We just need better data scientists. We just need to teach people how to code better. And I appreciate the perspective. I think that we do need to improve some of our data science curriculums and the way that we teach. But I think that just like in computer science, where when you take a database course, you're also taught the right way to create your tables and the right way to store your data and how to encrypt your data. You also need to be taught where your pause points are. You need to be taught where you need to be looking at, is this the right way to do this? Or is there another way? Ethics isn't about don't do it. Ethics is about, is this the best way to do this? And that question of best is where things get really mushy. Because for some companies, and based on some views of the use of data, best means how do I make the most money off of it? What I'm happy to see is that people and customers and consumers are getting really smart about this. They're scared. And they're getting more control over their ability to say yes and no about their use of data. As soon as we start giving more power to people, companies will be incentivized to do better. They will, because right now they're not incentivized to do it. If I can sell data, why wouldn't I sell it? What's the harm? If they do something bad with it, that's not my fault. I didn't tell them to do that. That is kind of the way of the world. But just like doctors have their do no harm, sectors and industries need codes of conduct and need rules of the road. Computer scientists have it. Every certification you get has a code of conduct and has a set of standards that you are expected to hold yourself to as a professional. Why wouldn't we have it in data science?
Very interesting. We need to kind of wrap up, but I wanted to get your view and maybe your advice for high school students, for people who aren't necessarily, headed towards, hardcore coding or careers.
Mm-hmm.
But, is there a level of conceptual knowledge or understanding that you think all of us need to develop?
Absolutely. I think that what you're going to see a lot of now and what I hope happens is there needs to be more education around data ownership. I think that individuals at any age, if you can have a phone and if you can get on the internet, you need to understand your digital presence, which means you need to understand your data and what that responsibility looks like. Do I think everybody needs to learn how to write algorithms? No. But I think that you need to understand that when you check that box and sign up for that mailing list, that you're giving access to your data. An example I can give is that Amazon Prime, during their Prime Day, where everything was really cheap on Amazon, they also had a special that said, if you give us access to your internet movements, we will give you $200. $200 just so that they can track your movements. If we don't make it so that people understand what that means as individuals, that you get $200, but you've basically allowed Amazon access to all of your information and all of your movements. Everything that you do that involves the internet. That's scary. That's like opening your front door and saying anybody who's got $200 can come in. Would you do that? So then why would we allow Amazon to do that? And we're starting to see legislation that's enabling more of those types of transactions to happen, and that's scary for me. Because if people don't understand and can make thoughtful decisions around doing that, then we're setting ourselves up for more problems in the future. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying be aware of what the dangers are of doing it before you do it. And that's where I think everybody needs some form of education. Just like, what does it mean?
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much for speaking with us. The students will get a chance to post questions for you after they watch this. So we will say goodbye for now, and thank you very much.
Thank you. See you soon.